Story is called A Change in Fortune. On the hot evening of September 20th, 1987, 37-year-old Maria Ferreira hosted a lively family gathering at her small home in Goiania, Brazil. Goiania was a cosmopolitan city with nearly 1 million people. Gleaming skyscrapers and tropical fruit trees lined the wealthy downtown area. But there were also areas of extreme poverty. Maria and her husband, Davayer, lived in one of these lower-income neighborhoods where they owned and operated a scrapyard on their property. It was hard work, especially in the intense tropical heat. But Maria and Davayer made a great team. Maria liked to joke that even though Davayer was short and stocky, he always had his head in the clouds. Davayer would tease Maria when she took things too seriously, saying that was why she had a gray streak in her long brown hair. But on this night, Maria was totally relaxed. There was plenty of delicious food and drink with people she loved, and they were able to pay for it because they had a little extra money from selling more scrap metal than usual. Maria and Davayer had also acquired a rare good luck charm a few days earlier. They never had much in the way of material possessions, but they tried to find beauty in their everyday life. This time, it was in a trinket Davayer had found. As they passed it around the table, she felt grateful for all the good fortune that had come their way. In the chair next to Maria, Davayer scooped a spoonful of black bean and pork stew onto his plate. He was listening to his brother, who was a bus driver, tell a story. He always had something funny to share from one of his routes. Davayer's other brother, Ivo, was there as well with his wife and their 6-year-old daughter, Lei Ji. The little girl's big brown eyes and joyful laugh filled Maria with love. Lei Ji was the closest thing she had had to a daughter since she didn't have any children of her own. It was the perfect night, and that called for a toast. Once everyone refilled their glasses, Maria raised hers in the air and thanked her family for coming. They all cheered and drank to the future. Later, after everyone left, Davayer went into the garage to finish up some work. As Maria washed coffee cups and put away plates, she could hear thunder in the distance. The next morning, on September 21st, Maria woke to the sound of rain pelting her tin rooftop. Goiania's rainy season normally ran from October to April, but this year it had started earlier than usual. As Maria climbed out of bed, she noticed that she didn't feel well. Her body was stiff and her stomach felt upset. She wrote off her discomfort to the previous night's festivities and tried to carry on with her day. But as time passed, Maria was starting to feel increasingly sick until finally, after a few hours, she started violently vomiting. Now, the pain in Maria's stomach was so bad that she decided she needed to see a doctor right away. She slowly got dressed and walked out to tell Davayer. Maria found him working in the scrapyard. It was cluttered with old refrigerators, large pieces of sheet metal, and disassembled machines. Davayer offered to take her, but she said she didn't want to distract him from his work, so she told him she could get there on her own. Maria took a bus to a nearby hospital and was able to see a doctor right away. After the doctor examined her, he said everything was fine. She must be having an allergic reaction to something she ate. Maria was relieved it wasn't something more serious. She found it hard to believe she could be this sick from food she was used to eating, but the doctor reassured her and said to go home and rest and she would feel better soon. But that evening, Maria still felt just as sick. She called her mom, who lived in a neighboring town, and asked her to come stay for a few days. Maria's mother took a bus there right away, and once she got there, she did her best to nurse her daughter back to health, feeding her broth and herbs, but whatever Maria had caught, it just wasn't going away. Even worse, Maria's mother soon started to feel sick too, with the same symptoms of fever and upset stomach that Maria had. So 2 days later, Maria's mom had to return back to her home to rest and recuperate as well. Maria was confused. If she was suffering from a food allergy like the doctor thought, why would her mom have gotten sick too? So now she thought maybe she'd come down with the flu and her mother had just caught it from her. So when her brother-in-law, Ivo, stopped by the house on September 24th, Maria tried to keep her distance from him. She'd been sick for 4 days and didn't want to risk passing anything on. Ivo didn't stay long at Maria and Davayer's house. and soon he got back to his own home right in time for lunch. His wife had put out some egg sandwiches, and after Ivo and his wife had sat down to eat, they called in their daughter, Leiji, to come join them. But Leiji was having too much fun playing with her dolls, her glitter, and her coloring books. Finally, Leiji did abandon her toys and took her seat at the table with her parents. But just 10 minutes after eating, Leiji threw up. Then, later that afternoon, Ivo and his wife got sick too. At first, they thought it was the eggs they had for lunch, but Ivo soon realized this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. It seemed like almost everyone who had gone to the Ferreira household recently was getting sick. And by now, that included De Valliere, who was feeling nauseous, as well as his mother, who had come by to visit. The list grew to include 2 of De Valliere's brothers and a handful of their children. The sickness had even spread to several of the neighbors who had visited with Maria and De Valliere. 2 of De Valliere's scrapyard employees had also become ill, all in the span of a week. When Maria found out about the growing number of people who were getting sick, she was horrified, and she became even more afraid when she noticed something else very disturbing. There were these red lesions that were showing up on her skin that were painful to the touch. By September 27th, nearly a week after first getting sick, Maria's stomach pain was unbearable. As she lay curled up in bed listening to the rain falling outside, she thought back to that last night she felt healthy. It was the same night she had hosted the big family gathering. Maria tried to remember everything she had done that night. Then she realized something. There was only one thing that everyone who had gotten sick over the last 10 days had in common. Maria could barely move, but she knew what she had to do next. If she didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, her whole family could be in serious danger. And so, on the next morning, she willed herself out of bed and slowly managed to get dressed. Then she gathered the evidence she needed in a cloth sack. Maria knew where she wanted to take it, and it wasn't to the hospital where she'd been before. She was going somewhere that had the authority to help her. The only issue was, she needed someone to go with her. She was too exhausted to make the trip on her own. De Valliere wasn't feeling well enough to go with her, so she asked another scrapyard employee to accompany her. Maria let the young man carry the bag she'd packed. She was so weak she could barely keep moving. Just down the street, they boarded a crowded bus, and about a half hour later, they got off near an office called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. This was a public health agency that regulated pharmaceuticals, food products, and sanitary conditions. It was basically the Brazilian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Maria thought that if anybody could figure out what was making her and her family so sick, it would be someone at this agency. She and her companion entered the plain brick building through a courtyard and were taken into the office belonging to the agency's director. The young man helping Maria dropped the bag he was carrying on the official's desk. Then Maria wiped her flushed face with a handkerchief and explained what it was. She said the contents of the bag were killing her family. The official just stared at her. He looked inside the bag and seemed confused. The items inside didn't look particularly dangerous. He said what really concerned him was Maria. Maria knew she was sweating and visibly shaking, and she noticed his expression as he looked at all the lesions and burn-like marks on her arms. The official told her that right now, she just needed to see a doctor, but he did promise he would take a closer look at what was in the bag. And, just to be safe, the official put the bag on a chair in the building's courtyard, then made sure Maria knew how to get to the nearest health clinic. Maria was skeptical. The last time she'd seen a doctor, he'd given her the wrong diagnosis, but she didn't know what else to do, so she and her companion left the agency and headed to the bus stop. Maria insisted that her companion return to the scrapyard and get back to work. Unsure and scared about what she would find out, Maria boarded the bus alone. A short time later, a doctor at this clinic carefully examined Maria and then gave her a new diagnosis. He said she was right. She was not experiencing an allergic reaction or food poisoning. What she had was a tropical disease, and her family and friends who were sick probably had it too. He explained that the unusually heavy rains had been spawning mosquitoes and a host of other bugs that carried infectious diseases. A virus like dengue or Zika would explain her symptoms, including the burn-like lesions she'd developed. The doctor assured Maria that this was all very manageable and that everything would be okay. Then he arranged to have her transported to the Tropical Diseases Hospital for specialized treatment. Maria's unease lightened, and she even managed a weak smile. She finally had a real explanation for what was happening to her and her family. It was a relief to think that the bag she had left at the health agency didn't actually have anything to do with a tropical virus. Less than an hour later, Maria arrived at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. As a doctor took her vitals, she asked if he knew what type of virus was going around. But instead of answering her question, the doctor gently took her arm and began closely examining her skin lesions. Then he called one of the nurses over to look at them. The nurse said she'd seen some other patients with similar burns in the last few days. Suddenly, the doctor's face turned serious, which made Maria extremely nervous. He continued to examine her, and then he stepped back. He explained that the doctor at the previous health clinic had been wrong too. Maria's symptoms did not line up with any kind of tropical disease he'd ever treated. In fact, this doctor was afraid Maria's symptoms were connected to another sickness entirely, and if he was even partially correct, they would need to move quickly. This could be a dangerous situation. The doctor asked her detailed questions about the past several days, and Maria shared everything she could remember. She could see the alarm spread across his face the more they talked. Maria felt a terrible wave of panic and nausea start to wash over her, and then she felt like she needed to tell him about the bag. So she explained that she had brought this bag and left it at the public health agency in hopes that they would analyze it. As soon as she said this, the doctor quickly excused himself and ran as fast as he could to the phone. He called a physician at the state's Department of the Environment. He tried to hide the rising panic in his voice as he explained the urgency of the situation and that action needed to be taken immediately. Both doctors agreed that the bag Maria brought to the public health office had to be examined as soon as possible to prevent the spread of what was making everyone sick. The doctor at the Department of the Environment knew a specialist named Walter Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, who had no relation to Maria and her family, would be able to properly analyze the bag's contents. But because it was late in the evening, they wouldn't be able to contact him until the next day. Early the next morning, Dr. Ferreira was getting dressed when his phone rang. It was the doctor from the Department of the Environment calling. Dr. Ferreira paced anxiously as he learned what was going on. There was a huge crisis taking place in Goiania, and he needed to act quickly. He scribbled down the address to the public health office where the bag was, and then ran out the door and went to a nearby office to grab some equipment. He hoped his colleague at the Department of the Environment was wrong about everything, because if he wasn't, that meant thousands of lives were now in danger. About an hour later, Dr. Ferreira arrived at the public health office. Before he entered the courtyard, he pulled a device out of a case. The device would reveal if their terrible suspicions were correct. He carefully switched on the piece of equipment, but right away it seemed like the device was malfunctioning. And no matter how much Dr. Ferreira struggled to adjust the equipment, it just wouldn't work. The readings were just so impossible that he assumed it had to be broken. Dr. Ferreira was frustrated. Now he would need to go back to his office and swap out this broken device for a new one. So he let the receptionist know he'd be back as soon as possible. Almost 2 hours later, Dr. Ferreira returned with a replacement piece of equipment. When he turned that one on, the exact same thing happened. The readings were impossible. He tried turning it on and off several times, but he just kept getting these totally incredible readings. After a few minutes, Dr. Ferreira was horrified to realize that he had been wrong. Both of these devices had been working perfectly fine, and that meant the reality of this situation was much, much worse. If this situation didn't get handled, the whole city of Goiania could have a catastrophic health crisis on their hands, and maybe all of Brazil could have a health crisis on their hands. So Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to get to that bag. Dr. Ferreira ran inside the building and was met by the facility's director. Ferreira asked where this bag was, but the director explained that he had become concerned about the bag's contents, so he had called in the fire brigade for assistance. In fact, the firefighters were already there and were about to take the bag from the building's courtyard. Their plan was to dispose of it in a nearby stream. Dr. Ferreira ran into the courtyard and saw a group of firefighters surrounding the bag. He yelled for them to stop, and that if they threw it in the water, it would trigger a horrific disaster. He warned them not to touch it and insisted that everyone just evacuate the building. Once Dr. Ferreira was able to explain what was happening, the firefighters realized just how serious this situation was, and they helped him clear the area. But the day was far from over. Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to track down Maria and speak to her about the contents of this bag. He located her at a hospital, but her condition had now worsened to the point where she was just too weak to even talk. But she was able to instruct Dr. Ferreira to just go to her family's junkyard, where he would find her husband, and he could answer any questions the doctor might have. It was noon by the time Dr. Ferreira and his colleague got to Maria and Devaier's scrapyard. When they arrived, they saw Devaier working next to his garage. Dr. Ferreira introduced himself and tried to shake Devaier's hand, but Devaier politely refused, and then he showed them the inside of his hand, and there was this huge open sore on his palm. Dr. Ferreira looked at it and then immediately shot a look of worry at his colleague. The doctor knew this type of wound on Devaier's hand could only be caused by one thing, and it was the thing that Dr. Ferreira feared the most. Devaier told them that this whole situation began 11 days earlier on September 18th. That morning, around 10 a.m., a young man had stopped by their scrapyard and told him about some scrap metal he'd found and wanted to sell. He had never seen anything like it and thought it was valuable. Devaier said he was interested and told the young man to bring it over. Later that day, the young man returned, now hauling something in a wheelbarrow. Inside this wheelbarrow were the disassembled pieces of a large metal contraption. There was also a small capsule shaped like an oversized thermos. Devaier thought both items were made of stainless steel, which would earn him a nice profit. But after Devaier examined the capsule more closely, he became even more excited. It was lined with lead, which was an even more valuable metal. Devaier paid the man the equivalent of about $30 and brought his new purchases into his garage. He left them there before heading inside to eat dinner. Once he was done eating, he headed back to the garage to start extracting the lead. But when Devaier opened back up the garage doors, he was amazed by what he now saw inside. A strange blue glow was now coming from the thermos-shaped capsule. Devaier was a deeply spiritual man and thought he might have encountered something supernatural. He grabbed the metal capsule and called Maria into the garage so she could see it too. When Maria saw its unusual glow, she was just as mystified as Devaier. They took a closer look and saw that the blue light was coming through a small window on the side of the capsule. The window looked like it had already been punctured with a screwdriver, probably by the young man who had just sold it to Devaier. Maria thought there could be a priceless gemstone hidden inside, but Devaier was sure that it was actually a holy relic that would bring blessings and good fortune to the family. Devaier was determined to continue examining this object. So he poked around the small opening with a screwdriver and removed what appeared to be several small pellets of a glittery bluish powder. The pellets were part of a slightly bigger pile that still sat deep inside the capsule. For all Devaier knew, this luminous powder could be worth thousands of dollars. It could change their lives in a way they'd never imagined. As Devaier told the doctors of this discovery, he remembered how special he felt handling the powder, and he wanted his whole family to experience it. This was the good luck charm they shared at their big family dinner. Over the next few days, Devaier shared his discovery with more family and friends and neighbors, and each time someone came over, he brought out the special glitter. small groups of people gathered around the capsule and peered through the broken window to admire the glowing powder inside. Many touched the small pellets Devayer had extracted. Seeing how excited everyone was about the powder made Devayer determined to extract the rest of it from the capsule. So a friend came over and, using a screwdriver, helped him remove fragments from behind the glass window. Eventually, they did get it all out. The entire pile was small enough to fit in the palm of Devayer's hand. Once all the powder had been extracted, Devayer gave the capsule to 2 of his employees and asked them to melt it down for metal and sell it to a nearby scrapyard. Then he brought some of the powder to Maria, who in turn dusted it all over her pajamas and bed sheets. Devayer gave a grain-sized fragment to his brother, the bus driver, who rubbed it on his hands before heading into work. And on his shift as a bus driver, he came into contact with dozens of people. Another one of Devayer's brothers dipped his finger in the blue powder and traced a cross on his abdomen for divine protection. Maria's mother handled some of the powder while she was taking care of Maria, and then she too became ill. Around that same time, Devayer had given some fragments to his brother Ivo, and later, Ivo's daughter, Leiji, played with the glittery crystals and rubbed them all over her hands and arms. And then immediately after doing that, she had eaten her egg sandwich and become ill right away. Devayer also shared his good luck charm with several neighbors who began having symptoms as well. After Maria had spent days wondering what might have caused so many people to get sick so quickly, she finally realized they all had one thing in common. They all had come in contact with this mysterious blue powder. So, on the morning of September 28th, 10 days after buying this capsule, Maria told Devayer she was taking what was left of the powder and the capsule to the local health agency to be analyzed. She placed these remnants in a large cloth bag, then she headed out with one of Devayer's employees to retrieve the parts of the capsule that had been sold to the other scrapyards. She managed to collect most of it. Those were also placed in the bag that Maria brought to the public health office. The story confirmed Dr. Ferreira's worst fears. He asked Devayer about the young man who first sold him the capsule and where he'd gotten it. Devayer said he wasn't sure, but he thought it might have come from some sort of abandoned facility that was located nearby. Dr. Ferreira turned to his colleague and saw that the other doctor's face had now gone white, because he knew exactly where that capsule had come from. It was a clinic that had closed 2 years earlier, a cancer treatment clinic. The capsule had come from a radiation therapy machine, and the magical blue powder that was inside wasn't from a precious gemstone. The powder was a highly radioactive material called cesium-137. When properly contained in the capsule, the powder's destructive capabilities could be used for focused cancer treatments. But without that protective shell, the powder became one of the most lethal substances on Earth. Maria and the others were not suffering from a tropical disease or any of the other things that doctors first thought. They were experiencing massive radiation poisoning, and the lesions they had developed were radiation burns. The handful of powder that Devayer found was enough to make more than 200 people extremely ill and place thousands more in danger. Dr. Ferreira knew all this because he was a medical physicist, and the tool he had tried to use outside of the public health agency was a radiation detector. He thought both detectors were broken because they were making so much noise and their readings were so high they were literally off the charts. But the detectors were correct. They were reading such high levels of radiation in the vicinity of where this bag was that contained the powder that the federal government would have to get involved. And now that Dr. Ferreira had confirmed just how serious the situation had become, he contacted Brazil's Nuclear Energy Commission. Within a matter of hours, they started testing thousands of Goiania's residents for radiation poisoning in the city's sports stadium. On the morning of September 30th, 13 days after Devayer bought the capsule, workers in hazmat suits arrived in the courtyard of the health agency to properly dispose of the bag that contained the radioactive material. The abandoned cancer clinic where the blue powder was first discovered was demolished as well. On October 23rd, Maria Ferreira finally died. Her niece, Leiji, also died on the same day. They were each buried in special fiberglass, lead-lined coffins to prevent radiation from leaking out. By the end of the month, Debayer's 2 young employees also died as a result of the exposure they had received when they melted down the capsule for Debayer. While Maria's husband, Debayer, survived the tragedy, he never mentally recovered. Debayer died in 1994, 7 years later. Thankfully, no one else died from the radiation exposure, but many others sustained amputations, severe burn scars, and lifelong medical conditions. The Goiania incident remains one of history's deadliest disasters involving medical radiation. Called Sanju's belly. On a humid summer morning in June 1999, 36-year-old Sanju Bhagat was hard at work on a farm outside of Nagpur, a city in central India. The sun had just risen, and the air was already so hot that he found it hard to breathe. Sanju and a group of farmhands were hard at work tending to the soybean crops. He made his way through the field, stopping to catch his breath every few steps. Sanju moved a lot slower than his coworkers because of his massive belly. For the past 15 years, Sanju had struggled beneath the weight of his ever-growing stomach. At first, when he was in his early 20s, his family had thought he was just filling out a little, like all young men do when they become adults. But Sanju's stomach didn't stop growing. It kept getting bigger and bigger until it had swelled to the size of a massive watermelon. But his arms and legs stayed stick-thin. He never understood why his belly kept growing since he didn't eat much. By the time Sanju reached his early 30s, he was in constant pain, and his family desperately wanted him to see a doctor. But he couldn't afford to take time off of work. Although, deep down, he had to admit he was a little scared of what the doctor might find. Sanju wiped the sweat from his eyes and told himself to keep moving. As he shoveled, he overheard another farmhand make a nasty joke about maternity clothes. A few men laughed. People liked to joke that he looked pregnant. Sanju had been relentlessly teased about his so-called pregnancy for years. His neighbors and his old childhood friends would point and laugh at him. He knew he should be used to it by now, but it still upset him. But his belly wasn't just a source of embarrassment for Sanju. The sheer weight of his stomach made even the simplest things like getting up from a chair or bending over very hard to do. Even now, as he pushed himself to keep up with the other men in the field, he could feel his back stiffening and his arms and shoulders aching. By midday, he felt ready to drop from physical exhaustion. The sun beat down on Sanju's head and he could feel his chest tighten. He tried to keep working, but today it was harder to breathe than usual. No matter how deeply he inhaled, he couldn't quite catch his breath. Finally, he dropped his shovel and doubled over, gasping for air. Sanju gathered what little strength he had left and stood up straight. He could feel other farm workers' eyes on him as he gathered his tools and headed home. It was the longest walk of Sanju's life. He felt humiliated and useless, but he was also afraid. He could barely take a breath. By the time he got to the small home he shared with his family, he nearly fell through the front door. The last thing he remembered was falling hard on the tile floor. Sanju's mother was fixing lunch in the kitchen when she heard a noise in the front of the house. She ran into the living room and found her son collapsed on the floor. She grabbed the phone and called an ambulance, then rushed to Sanju's side and knelt down beside him. She tried to roll him over on his back so he could breathe better, but it was very difficult because of his enormous stomach. She muttered every prayer she could think of, straining her ears for the sound of a siren. And finally, in the distance, she heard it. By the time the ambulance pulled up in front of their home, Sanju was barely breathing. The paramedics quickly assessed Sanju's condition. They put an oxygen mask on him, then strapped him to a gurney and loaded him up into an ambulance. Sanju's mother wanted to go with him, but the nearest major hospital was in Mumbai, an 11-hour drive from Nagpur. All she could do was watch as the ambulance sped away with her son. Early the next morning, Dr. Ajay Mehta had just started his shift in the oncology ward at Tata Memorial Hospital. He was alerted that a new patient named Sanju Bhagat had been brought in all the way from Nagpur and that he needed to be seen right away. Dr. Mehta hurried over to Sanju's room. If someone was rushed in an ambulance from so far away, it had to be a serious emergency. As soon as Dr. Mehta examined Sanju's giant swollen belly, he instructed the nurse to prepare the operating room for surgery. Dr. Mehta was a specialist in tumor removal, and he was certain that Sanju had a massive tumor in his stomach, possibly the biggest one he'd ever seen. The tumor was likely pressing against Sanju's diaphragm, which was why he couldn't breathe. And given how big it was, and Sanju's weakened condition, the tumor had to be removed immediately. While another nurse prepped Sanju for the operation, Dr. Mehta gathered his surgical team and headed to the operating room. As they sterilized their hands and put on clean scrubs, Dr. Mehta warned them that the tumor's sheer size would make this a very challenging operation. There was a risk of damaging the soft tissue in Sanju's stomach, his nerve endings, or blood vessels. In the worst case, the surgery could cause severe internal bleeding or even death. A few minutes later, Sanju was wheeled into the operating room on a gurney. Once he was under anesthesia, Dr. Mehta called for a scalpel. He placed one hand on Sanju's stomach for leverage, then he cut into Sanju's belly. After the blade broke through Sanju's skin and opened up his chest area, Dr. Mehta expected to see blood and a bright red mass of cancerous cells. Instead, gallons of thick, yellowish fluid gushed from Sanju's stomach, spilling onto the floor. The entire surgical team gasped. Dr. Mehta jumped out of the way, trying to avoid the surge of bile. It had a foul odor that made everyone in the room start to gag. Nurses ran toward him with towels, trying to sop up the putrid-smelling liquid. While they cleaned up the mess, Dr. Mehta remained calm and carefully inserted his hand into Sanju's stomach to locate the tumor. At first, all he felt was thick jelly-like fluid sliding between his fingers. Then he grazed something unusual. His eyes went wide as he dove a little deeper. His palm wrapped around something soft, but with a brittle core. He realized this was not a tumor. Whatever was in Sanju's stomach had bones, a lot of them. Dr. Mehta's jaw dropped as his hand explored the object floating in Sanju's stomach. He grabbed onto one of the tiny bones and began to slowly pull it up and out of Sanju's stomach. As he lifted the bizarre object into the air, he could hear more gasps from everyone in the room. Dr. Mehta could hardly believe his eyes. What he was looking at shouldn't be possible. He had never seen anything like this in his entire medical career. He placed it on a medical tray for analysis and turned back to Sanju. Thankfully, he had survived the operation, but Dr. Mehta couldn't help but speculate how something so strange could have gotten inside of Sanju. A few hours later, Sanju awoke in a hospital bed. His stomach was sore, but when he moved his hand to grasp his belly, he looked down in shock. The giant lump was gone. He ran his hand over his flat stomach. He hadn't seen it like this in almost 20 years. He took a deep breath and smiled as he felt his chest expand. He couldn't believe he could breathe again without any pain. Just then, Dr. Mehta appeared in the doorway to Sanju's room with a very serious look on his face. He confirmed that the surgery was a success, but as Dr. Mehta explained what they had found inside of his body, the smile slowly faded from Sanju's face. The object Dr. Mehta had removed from Sanju's stomach was a ball of pink flesh with a tuft of dark brown hair growing along one side. 2 fully formed feet protruded from either end. In the middle was the beginning of a jawline. But what Dr. Maida couldn't forget was the fully formed human hand that was attached to this ball of flesh. It was what he had grasped in a gruesome handshake when he lowered his hand into Sanju's stomach. The hand had fingernails protruding from it. The nails were so overgrown they almost looked like tiny claws. A grayish-yellow tube grew out of the center of the fleshy mass, connecting it to Sanju's stomach. Dr. Maida told Sanju that the surgical staff had witnessed one of the rarest medical conditions on Earth. In a way, Sanju had been pregnant, not for the 16 years that his belly was protruding, but since before he was even born. The hairy, mutated lump he had removed was Sanju's twin. Sanju was a victim of an incredibly rare condition called fetus in fetu, which means fetus in fetus. When Sanju and his twin were first conceived, they started out as identical twins, which is when a single fertilized egg splits into 2 embryos. But something went wrong during that division, and the cells that became Sanju's twin latched onto his embryo. As Sanju developed, his body formed around the twin cells, which in turn fed off his bloodstream. This twin did not have a functional brain or heart, so it wasn't alive in the traditional sense. But as Sanju grew, so did his twin. It fed on the contents of Sanju's stomach like a parasite, using the yellowish tube as an umbilical cord. If Dr. Maida hadn't eventually removed it from Sanju's stomach, it would have gotten so big that it would have killed Sanju. Sanju recovered physically from the surgery in just a few weeks. But when he returned to Nagpur, he was upset to find that his neighbors still made fun of him. Word had spread in the news about what had been inside of his stomach. Instead of calling him pregnant, now he was the man who gave birth to his brother. After his surgery, Sanju refused to allow doctors to follow up with his case. He never wanted a reminder that he had carried a dead twin inside of his belly. The next and final story is called One by One. In the spring of 1862, a man in London, England, named Richard Turner, sat on his son's bed. He held the sick little boy in his arms and spooned some medicine into his mouth. The child swallowed it and then let out a painful cough. Richard's wife, Elizabeth, who was standing by his side, looked at her husband with alarm. It had been a horrific few months for Richard and his family. 2 of their 4 kids had become ill and died of a deadly disease called diphtheria. As their son coughed again, both parents knew he had contracted the disease as well. In the 19th century, diphtheria was a plague across England and Europe. It caused dead tissue to build up in the back of the victim's throat. Eventually, this dead tissue would harden into a thick gray membrane, and it would become impossible for the victim to swallow or breathe. Diphtheria spread rapidly and affected children more than adults. Often, entire city blocks full of kids became sick at the same time. It was highly contagious, painful, and almost always fatal. Worst of all, there was no cure. All that doctors could do was administer a variety of tonics and hope they would reduce the symptoms enough for the patient's body to fight off the disease on its own. The Turners had brought in doctors to try and save their children, but nothing the physicians tried had worked. Now, all Richard and Elizabeth could do was watch helplessly as their 3rd child got paler and weaker from the lack of oxygen. The little boy became delirious and drifted in and out of consciousness. Just 1 week after he got sick, he died in his parents' arms. At the start of the year, they had 4 healthy children. Now they only had 1 child left. a 3-year-old girl named Anne Amelia. The Turners were completely devastated. But they were also perplexed. The rest of their neighborhood seemed untouched by this disease, while only their family was affected. The morning after their son's death, Richard went to work in a haze of grief. Over the next few weeks, they barely slept at night because they were listening for any sign of Anne Amelia getting sick too. Then, late one night, while Richard and Elizabeth were laying in bed, they heard a sound from Anne Amelia's bedroom, a tiny cough and then another. Richard's heart filled with dread. Diphtheria had come for their last child. By breakfast, Anne Amelia was visibly weak. She struggled to swallow her biscuit, and even sipping warm milk was painful. Richard and his wife couldn't just sit by and watch their last child die. There had to be someone in the medical field who could help Anne Amelia. Their neighbor told them about a doctor they'd heard of who was considered one of the best in London. His name was Thomas Orton. If anyone could help their child get better, it was him. The next morning, Richard made his way to the hospital where Dr. Orton practiced. He managed to meet with him and begged the doctor for his help. Initially, Dr. Orton was resistant to the idea. He was extremely busy, and since there was no cure for diphtheria, he was skeptical that he'd actually be able to help them. But Richard would not give up. He pleaded with the doctor to please help what was left of his family. Their daughter's life was at stake. Dr. Orton was moved. He nodded as he shook Richard's hand, and he agreed to help them. The next morning, on April 3, 1862, Dr. Orton packed his medical bag and left for the Turner home. The family lived in the Limehouse district, which was one of London's poorest neighborhoods. He wasn't shocked that sickness was prevalent there. The 1800s were a dark time for the entire city. The Industrial Revolution had turned London into a crowded, polluted mess. No matter where you went, it was difficult to escape the stink of raw sewage. Factories spewed toxic black smoke which permanently lingered in the air as a thick haze. Dr. Orton's carriage sped through the dense crowds, past beggars holding out hands for money, many of whom were children. Across the River Thames, trash and dead fish lined the banks. In the Limehouse neighborhood, conditions were even worse. Dr. Orton placed a handkerchief over his nose and mouth to minimize the foul smell of animal waste and rotten food that seemed to be everywhere. When the carriage finally arrived at the Turners' home, Dr. Orton stepped down onto the narrow sidewalk, then he walked to their door, braced himself, and knocked. Richard Turner opened it, looking exhausted and ashen-faced, but he lit up at the sight of this doctor and welcomed him inside. Once Dr. Orton entered the tiny front parlor, he was pleasantly surprised. The home was like an oasis in this hellish neighborhood. It was clean, warm, and well-kept. The Turners brought him into the children's room. A few toys were scattered about on the floor. Colorful drawings hung on bright green wallpaper, and fresh plants were perched on the dresser. Little Anne Amelia sat slumped on the bed against a pillow, covered in heavy blankets. She barely stirred when they entered. Her head hung to the side and her eyes were glassy. Dr. Orton could hear her struggling to breathe. The doctor opened his leather bag and got to work examining the child. He pulled out a tongue depressor and asked Anne Amelia to open her mouth as wide as she could. When he looked inside to the back of her throat, he was surprised. He couldn't see any signs of a thick gray membrane normally caused by diphtheria. This was unusual, but it also meant that the disease clearly had not progressed as far as he had feared. With treatment, maybe he had time to suppress her symptoms and give her body time to heal itself. He spoon-fed her some opium tincture to ease her discomfort and showed Mrs. Turner how to rub ointment made from coal tar on her daughter's chest. Then he shared his findings with Richard and his wife. He hoped he had gotten to Anne Amelia's symptoms in time before the diphtheria overwhelmed her. Dr. Orton could see relief wash over the parents' faces. Now all they could do was wait. Over the next 2 weeks, Anne Amelia did not improve. Even though Dr. Orton checked in on her and her parents tended to her night and day, she still became even weaker. and just before the end of April, the 3-year-old died. The Turners were destroyed. Their entire family had been wiped out in less than 2 months. Dr. Orton's heart broke for them. He felt frustrated and angry. He couldn't get little Ann Amelia's case out of his head. Something just didn't seem right. The day after Ann Amelia's death, Dr. Orton sat in his office, poring through his notes. He struggled to make sense of what had happened. Every other doctor the Turners had hired had diagnosed the children with diphtheria, and all signs did point to that being the disease they all had. Except Ann Amelia's throat had never developed the thick membrane that normally came with diphtheria. Dr. Orton couldn't shake the feeling that something else had killed her and potentially had killed her siblings. It was a crazy thought, but if it was true, that could explain why no one else in their neighborhood had caught the highly contagious disease. Perhaps what killed the Turner children wasn't contagious after all. Dr. Orton was anxious to get more information from the Turners. So just after Ann Amelia's passing, the doctor returned to their house. Despite their overwhelming grief, the two parents welcomed Dr. Orton inside, and they sat together at the kitchen table. He asked them if anything had changed recently at home. He was curious whether they had eaten any new foods or maybe met new people in the area, but the parents said no, nothing has changed. Then the doctor asked if he could check their water source. At that time, families in the Limehouse district retrieved their water from pumps located on the street. People would have to queue up with buckets or tubs and haul whatever they could back home. The doctor inspected the water, and while it was far from clean, he couldn't imagine that it was the cause of their tragedy. And if it was, he didn't understand why other families weren't afflicted as well. Dr. Orton asked the Turners to think of anything else that might have changed in the last several months, anything. Mr. Turner paused and said the only thing he could think of had happened around Christmas. They had saved enough money to buy the kids some new blankets and toys. They had even redecorated their room. The holiday season had been festive and happy, and their good cheer continued into the new year. But then, in February, everything changed. That was when their oldest child fell sick. It happened so fast, and it seemed to come from nowhere. Since then, their lives had been a nightmare. Dr. Orton listened quietly, frustrated that he couldn't glean any clues from what the Turners were sharing. He thanked them as he got up from the table, and then asked if he might take one more look inside the children's room. Richard and his wife nodded. As he walked through the empty room, everything looked the same. The toys were still on the floor, the bed had the same blankets neatly pulled back. Then the doctor's eyes flickered past the pictures on one side of the wall, and that's when he saw something that he had not noticed before. A few hours later, Dr. Orton was sitting at a table in a dimly lit pub just around the corner from his office. Across the table from him was Dr. Henry Letheby, who was a professor of chemistry and taught at the most prestigious hospital in the country, the London Hospital. As they sipped whiskey, Dr. Orton told him about the diphtheria diagnosis of the Turner children. He described how none of the treatments had improved Ann Amelia's symptoms. Then he described how her throat had never been scarred by the leathery membrane that was so common in diphtheria. Dr. Letheby agreed that a number of things seemed suspicious, but if it wasn't diphtheria, he had no idea what else could have happened. That's when Dr. Orton shared what he had seen in the children's bedroom and why he thought it could explain the tragedy that had fallen on the Turners. Dr. Letheby thought it was a long shot, but he was intrigued by Orton's theory, and he agreed to help him test it. Ann Amelia had not been buried yet, so the next day, Dr. Orton ordered a tissue sample to be taken from her body. Then he sent that sample to Dr. Letheby for analysis. In the meantime, he ran some tests of his own on the unusual thing that he had discovered in the children's bedroom. A few days later, Dr. Letheby and Dr. Orton compared notes. They now understood the cause for the rapid and tragic deaths of the 4 Turner children, and it was not diphtheria. It all started just before Christmas. Richard and his wife wanted to make the children's room as festive as possible to celebrate the holiday season. So one Saturday, they decided to shop for new wallpaper and selected a pattern that the whole family loved. It was intricate and beautiful, and best of all, it was a stunningly bright green. The color was actually called Shayla's green, named after the designer. The shopkeeper told them it was a top seller at their store. When Richard put the paper up on the walls, the room was transformed. The 4 children were overjoyed. In fact, they were so mesmerized by the vivid green wallpaper, they tore off little pieces to play with. Sometimes they would lick it like candy. But what neither the children nor the parents realized was that there was actually a special ingredient in the dye. This ingredient helped to create that very bright green that they all loved so much, and this special ingredient made its way into the children's bodies and traveled through their bloodstreams. It saturated their lungs and caused fluid and mucus to build until one by one, it killed each child. That special ingredient was a deadly poison called arsenic. When Dr. Orton had returned to the children's room days before, he noticed that pieces of the wallpaper were missing. After questioning the Turners about the reason, and them saying their kids were ripping them off and licking them, and then after running tests on Aunt Amelia's stomach and then the wallpaper itself, the mystery was solved. At that time, arsenic was used in all kinds of household products, from women's makeup to children's toys to dye for all sorts of fabric, and it was in low enough doses that at the time it was considered safe to touch. But that brand of wallpaper was the exception. Word soon spread across England about what happened to the Turner children. Dr. Orton's discovery sparked a national outrage, and concerned parents protested for the wallpaper to be banned. Dr. Orton campaigned for years until eventually the manufacturing of arsenic-based dyes was stopped. Thanks to Aunt Amelia, many children's lives were saved.